Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar about NEH's Archaeological and Ethnographic Field Research Program. My name is Meredith Mink, and I'm a program officer at NEH, and I'm the team lead for the Field Research Program. Today, I'm joined by Jenny Ingram from our Office of Grants Management, Christopher Thornton, the Director of the Division of Research, and Amy Trotter, our analyst for this program. So I'm going to be speaking for about 25 minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of our time answering your questions. You can go ahead and ask questions in the Q&A interface or the chat anytime throughout the presentation or after. And what we're going to do is I'm going to try to ask and answer all those questions verbally during the question and answer period so that the people who watch the recorded webinar will have a benefit of hearing those questions and hearing the answer. So this webinar will be recorded and archived, and as soon as possible, an updated link will be posted on our program webpage. The NEH does its grant work through 6 divisions, each focused on a different kind of work and audience. The Division of Research Programs supports the work of scholars individually or collaboratively on projects that embody exceptional research, rigorous analysis, and clear writing and communication. The Archaeological and Ethnographic Field Research Program is one of several opportunities within the Division of Research. As I discuss this grant opportunity throughout the webinar, I'm going to mention the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or what we more casually call the NOFO, and I'm going to talk about this document a lot. So this document can be found on the program webpage. All NEH programs have a webpage with program information and the Notice of Funding Opportunities posted on the webpage. Each program has a NOFO, and that's simply the guidelines for the program. So I'll start by giving you an overview of the program's goals. So the major goal of this program is to support rigorous field research projects conducted by either individual scholars or, of course, teams of collaborators. We support empirical fieldwork that answers significant research questions that are relevant to the humanities. So at a broad level, we're funding projects that make a compelling case for how the research is driven by humanistic questions and goals, and how it will add to humanities scholarship. The methods may be more social scientific, but the questions and impact must be clearly humanistic. Significance to the humanities is the first criteria by which each application is evaluated. Demonstrating the project's broad significance to the humanities is really especially important in this program. I'll talk more about the evaluation criteria in a moment. So let's get into some of the details of this program. Field research grants can be requested for between 4 to 36 months, and applicants can request up to $150,000. This means that the maximum funding request is $150,000 for 36 months of support. This year's application deadline is September 28th, 2023, and notifications will be sent out in April 2024. Projects for this year's award cycle can start as early as June 1st, 2024, and as late as May 1st, 2025. Please note that we also accept drafts in this program, so you can send us a draft of your narrative and work plan by June 16th, which is coming up quickly, and we'll provide you with feedback. The NEH Field Research Program makes approximately 6 awards per year. Based on the average application numbers that we receive, that makes our funding ratio about 11%. I don't want those numbers to discourage you, however. It is a competitive program, like all NEH programs, but of course, you can't get a grant unless you apply. And if you don't get an award the first time around, we really encourage applicants to request panelist feedback on your application, revise it, and reapply at the next deadline. Some notes on eligibility and suitable projects. So this is an institutional award program. Applications must come from an eligible type of institution, and awards are made to the institution and not to individuals. So eligible institutions include, of course, accredited institutions of higher education, so colleges and universities, but also nonprofit organizations that are registered as 501c3s, state and local governments and their agencies, and federally recognized Native American tribal governments. Grants in this program support field research specifically. So eligible projects must use archaeological or ethnographic methods. Projects do not need to employ both types of methodologies. For archaeological methods, we allow field survey, remote sensing, excavation, digital scanning, and ethnoarchaeology, among other types of work. And for ethnographic methods, we typically see and allow for participant observation, surveys, and oral histories. And I want to underscore that we see applications from a broad variety of disciplines in this program, including ethnolinguistics, ethnomusicology, sociology, cultural anthropology, the classics, etc. And of course, note that projects must respect relevant federal and foreign regulations. So, for example, if you're working in the United States and you're doing excavation, you need to remember that Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act will likely apply. And there's more information about that in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. At NEH, we use the term project director and not principal investigator. The project director must be affiliated with an institution that's willing to hold the grant. So that is an eligible institution that can apply to the program. And while a project may include collaborating scholars, NEH does not permit co-project directors in this program. So in cases where there are 2 or more project leaders, right, you would list one as the project director and include everyone else as collaborators on the application. Project directors are not required to be tenured, but must hold a PhD or equivalent terminal degree. So postdocs, for example, could be a project director on the application. If the project director is a tenured faculty member, applicants must request at least $20,000 in federal matching funds. And we're going to come back to this requirement in a moment. NEH strongly encourages you to work closely with local collaborators or local communities in the co-creation of knowledge and the preservation of culture whenever possible. Applicants should describe plans for consultation, collaboration, and any established relationships with host or descendant communities, if applicable, in their applications. And again, remember that if your work includes archaeological excavation or any ground disturbing activities, Section 106 will likely apply. And you want to include time for the consultation process in your application, in your project timeline. So the main focus of projects funded under this program must be on fieldwork. The program is designed to support field expenses, such as travel, accommodation, field staff and equipment, and salary replacement for project directors and collaborating scholars. Projects that focused on post fieldwork analysis or on publication and writing up of reports, including projects that are aimed primarily at the preservation and conservation of data or material, are really encouraged to apply to another NEH program. So projects that consist predominantly of lab-based analysis, for example, archival research, or the analysis of legacy collections are not funded under this program. While we fully understand the importance and value of working with legacy collections, applications for that kind of work would need to go to another NEH program. Similarly, projects that are, focused on writing up of results are not funded under this program. We do expect that any field research funded will ultimately result in a publication of some sort. And we do ask applicants to describe their dissemination plans, but the work proposed to be done during the grant period should really be focused on field research. Now, there's a little bit of wiggle room here. The spirit of the program is to fund fieldwork, but some post-fieldwork activities are allowable. So, for example, analysis that really needs to take place during the grant period in order to directly answer research questions is acceptable. For example, the timely radiocarbon dating of newly excavated material could be included as part of a proposal for this program. But it should only comprise a small portion of the work plan and budget. Note too, that we do allow for up to $5,000 per year for conservation and preservation efforts, including community education and outreach. So this is really with the understanding that some timely analysis might be necessary and that community education and outreach is often critical to successful fieldwork. So we built this element into the program to allow for these kinds of efforts. Finally, like any grant program, this program has some rules about what we do not fund. And there's a full list of what our program does not support, the funding restrictions, on page 29 of the NOFO. And I want to note in particular that we don't fund field schools in this competition. So this doesn't mean that you can't bring students, undergraduates, and graduate students into the field to participate as researchers. They can be included in the budget, but you should explain how they will contribute to the research and how they will be paid. So again, see the full list of funding restrictions on page 29 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So I'll discuss a couple tips for your application. The Notice of Funding Opportunity guides you through everything your application needs, including all the required components of the application package and the section headings that should structure your main narrative. And I've posted those section headings here on this slide. Please pay close attention to the page limits for attachments that are listed in the NOFO. Unfortunately, going over the page limits for any component of the application will result in the application being deemed ineligible. So for example, we require that resumes be no longer than 2 pages. So if you were to include your full lengthy academic CV, your application will be disqualified. The narrative is the central place where you describe your project and demonstrate its significance. And the narrative should be structured by the subject headings that appear in the Notice of Funding Opportunity and that also appear on this slide. The narrative should lead with clear research questions and to articulate how those research questions and your project is broadly significant to the humanities. And this is perhaps the most critical piece of advice that we give applicants to the program. We sometimes see narratives that are too tightly focused on, a sub discipline or written with very specific disciplinary language. And the most competitive proposals really argue for broader impact to the humanities at large. So there's a lot of text on this slide, but I wanted to highlight the program's review criteria for you. These 5 review criteria appear on page 29 and 30 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And this is what peer reviewers use to evaluate the applications in this program. As you write your narrative, keep the program review criteria in mind. So all NEH grant programs go through a peer review process, and applicants can also use those criteria to help structure the proposal and make a case for their project. Note again that the first review criteria is related to the project's relevance to the humanities. And I also wanted to make a note that NEH review panels are interdisciplinary. So the peer reviewers for this program will have a background in archaeological and ethnographic methods, of course, but they may not come from your specific field. So you should think about making a case for the significance and value of the project to a broader scholarly audience. Think about how your research questions could really inspire someone outside of your field or discipline. A little more on the overall evaluation process and timeline for this program. The federal grant process is long. It's approximately 7 months for this program. Again, the submission deadline for applications this year is September 28th. And that means that notifications will be made in April of 2024. Please note that late submissions will not be evaluated. Our peer review panels meet in November. And next, the NEH's National Council on the Humanities, which meets 3 times a year, review the staff's funding recommendations in March. Finally, the chair of the endowment, Shelley Lowe, makes the final funding decisions shortly after the National Council meets. And then again, notifications to applicants will go out in April of 2024. So just keep these steps and timeline in mind as you plan and prepare your application. And I wanted to note one more time that we review drafts in the program, and I think this is just the best opportunity to gain feedback from a program officer. So submitting a draft is totally optional, and it doesn't affect the later stages of the review process. Our peer reviewers don't see that you've submitted a draft, but it is the best way for potential applicants to get more substantive feedback. Again, this year's draft deadline is June 16th, so it's coming up quickly. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jenny Ingram, who's going to provide some more details about our matching requirement for this program.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I work in the Office of Grant Management here at NEH, and I work especially with successful applicants once they've been awarded. But I also do some work on the front end with things like budgets and real technical things. So I wanted to talk briefly about especially the matching fund component of these projects. So all applicants to this program can request matching funds. Those are federal funds from NEH that match gifts raised from a third-party source. I want to note that the award amount remains capped at $150,000, regardless of the combination of outright funds and matching funds. Third-party sources are sources other than the federal government or your institution. And also, if your institution has a foundation, that is not considered third party. So specifically in this program, projects that are led by a tenured faculty member must include a request for at least $20,000 in matching funds. What this means for you would be that the project director must raise at least $20,000 from third-party sources. So examples of third-party funds might be grants from nonprofit organizations and foundations, or gifts from private individuals. When you are applying, if you are in this category and you need to have $20,000 in matching funds, you need to include plans for fundraising in your application narrative, but you do not need to have funds in hand by the time of application. In your budget and justification documents, you'll also include the total NEH funds you're requesting, along with planning for how you'll spend those gift funds. So for example, if you had a budget for $20,000 in matching funds and $130,000 in NEH outright funds, so right there would be your $150,000 award maximum. We want to see a budget that's actually for $170,000 because it will include those $20,000 in gift funds. And we'd like you to delineate the gift funds too, so that it's clear what's going to be spent with federal money and what's going to be spent with this private money. And the NOFO really does go into detail about these things. And if you look in section C2, which starts on page 4 of the NOFO, you will find some very, very specific details about these things. I am always glad to answer individual questions about the budget as you are working on your application. And I believe Meredith has included my email address in the presentation so that you can reach out to me directly. And I'm sure we'll have some questions in our Q&A session too about the budget. So thank you, Meredith.
Awesome. Thank you, Jenny. And yes, your email is up there on the slide. And now we are ready for any questions that you might have. You can go ahead and ask them in the chat if you have any, and we're happy to answer them. Chris posted a link to the collaborative research program, which is really helpful. Thank you, Chris. And I'll include this information for those of you that are listening on the recorded webinar. We mentioned some of the cases in which people might want to think about another NEH program. For example, if you're working mainly with legacy collections, or the focus of the project is really writing up results, the collaborative research program in the Division of Research is one where we see a lot of people applying to for archaeological projects, for ethnographic projects. So there's some overlap there, but it allows for different kinds of work to be funded. We have a question in the chat. So if I apply for a multi-year grant and can't get matching funds the first year, would I continue to pursue them the following years? Jenny, do you want to go ahead and answer?
Yeah, so this is Jenny, and the answer is yes. You have up until, I believe it's 3 months before the end of your period of performance to meet the matching requirement. And what happens is that NEH releases the matching funds as you raise the gift funds, and so that could happen, for example, in smaller gifts, and as you raise them along the way, you certify, and then the funds are released. So we do not we do not hand out the matching funds up front. They get released as you raise funds, and down the line, you have almost the whole period of performance to raise them. I hope that answered your question. So it's ongoing, could be ongoing.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. We have another question here. The tribal community that we're working with for an archaeological survey is not open to the public. Are they still eligible for this funding? So that would, the tribal community themselves would need to be a federally recognized tribal community. Otherwise, there would need to be an association with a 501c3, a nonprofit, with the project director associated with the eligible institution. So the answer is possibly. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by not open to the public, but if you elaborate in the chat, we can potentially answer that question better for you. So we have a question about Section 106 process. So someone is considering collecting targeted samples from a site on private property. Can you expand on Section 106 process and the timeline that will be needed to be planned into the project? Yes. So there is more details in the Notice of Funding Opportunity about the Section 106 process. But briefly, if you include ground disturbing activities, excavation, and often coring in your plans for research in the United States, then it would be subject to Section 106 process. And you can go ahead and send us an email if you want more details about that process. We have a Section 106 expert at NEH, and we can follow up on that. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that all projects that include ground disturbing activities in the United States are evaluated for that, and they're evaluated for that post-award. And then we would get in touch with the applicants and discuss how they proceed with that process. So we can guide people through that process if they are to receive an award. And I wanted to note that sometimes consultation time, so if you're working on land that is associated with numerous Indigenous communities, you would want to include time for consultation process in your timeline, because that can be a lengthy process. Chris and Amy, do either of you also want to help me read some of the questions? There's a question here about the narrative as described in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. It asks for research questions and broader issues. So the question here is about our sample applications that are listed on the website. And the commenter notes that the sample applications don't necessarily show a common strategy or how to navigate all the issues that might come up in your application, and that's true. Our samples are examples of funded projects, but there might be more specific questions that you have about your own project. And I think the best answer to that is to submit a draft narrative by the deadline if you can. And it doesn't have to be a complete draft of your narrative. You could submit something that is very, very drafty, and we will get back to you with our feedback. And you can also schedule time to talk to us over the phone if you have specific questions about your project. Yes, and then Jenny, I don't know if you can see the chat, but there's a question here about, is it only tenured faculty that are as project directors that need matching funds or all applications? And that's a good question. So it's only when the project director is a tenured faculty member. So if the project director, for example, was associated with a nonprofit, for example, or if the project director was an assistant professor, they would not need to request the match. They could request matching funds, but they are not required to. And we have another question about matching. Is it still $20,000 in matching funds, even if I'm requesting $20,000 or less? So I'm assuming that the question is if your outright request was um, for a much smaller grant period and a much smaller outright request, would you still need to request the $20,000 in matching funds? And I think the answer there is yes. Um, it doesn't matter necessarily how long the period of performance that you request is. You would still have to ask for the match if you're tenured.
Meredith, the next question is asking if the plans for raising a match falls through, would they still receive the full requested amount?
Thank you. That's one we get a lot. Jenny, do you want to jump in again?
Sure. So I'm reading what this person wrote, and that is exactly true. So if plans for raising the third-party funds fell through and didn't materialize, would the awardee receive the 130,000 and just not receive the $20,000 in match? Yes, that is the case.
And then we have a question here about given that the majority of past recipients have been institutions of higher education, and that's correct, um, if there are any additional comments for nonprofit organizations or organizations that are registered as 501c3s to maximize their competitiveness for this program. And are there any nationality requirements for project directors? So I'll start with the first one. That's an interesting question. Typically, I think it is true that at institutional programs in NEH, we do tend to see a much higher percentage of applications coming from colleges and universities. But we're trying to sort of get the word out that those aren't the only types of institutions that can apply. I would keep in mind that while this is not always the case, many of our peer reviewers do come from the academic side of things. They tend to be, in this program, we have panels of 4 reviewers, and applications are grouped on panels clustered according to the methodology and the area where work takes place. And typically, those reviewers are often academics. So you want to keep in mind that you want your project to be legible and compelling to a more scholarly audience, even if it's coming from a nonprofit organization. I think the most competitive projects are really clear and make their case across disciplines again, but I don't know if I necessarily have any more specific information for a nonprofit organization. Again, I would suggest reaching out to us or submitting a draft so that a program officer could take a look at the application. Are there nationality requirements for the project director? There are, and I don't have that in my hand with me right now, but it is in the notice of funding opportunity. Amy or Jenny, do you remember off the top of your head, or Chris? I believe with all NEH applications, it's a residency requirement, but that is available in the notice of funding opportunity. So again, it's the institution that would have to be applying to the program, and the project director would have to be affiliated with that institution. Um, so if it's a case where it's someone that lives outside of the United States, but it's an eligible research institution, I think you should send us the question via email or make a time to chat with us would probably be the best way to answer that question specifically.
Meredith, we have another question regarding the Protecting Our Cultural Heritage initiative. Where they're asking for a clearer definition on what you mean by cultural heritage. Does that just include the US and American cities, or is it also international?
So, yeah, that's a great question. It would not necessarily include the US only. You know, we see cultural heritage projects for work that's field work that's being done outside of the United States. Um, and for those special initiatives, you don't necessarily need to respond directly to those in the application. It's something to keep in mind for applicants. But there's not necessarily, we're not, specifically evaluating applications based on that initiative. So I hope that answers your question. Chris, do you have specific guidance for the definition of cultural heritage? I don't know if he can hear us. So I think in that case, I don't know if I've answered that question exactly, but I would love to follow up with you about that. But we definitely do see applications for field work that's done outside of the United States, and um, that would be perfectly acceptable.
The next question kind of skirts along that same topic. They're asking what our history is in the program for funding international proposals.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's about evenly distributed, I believe. So typically the way we see between, well, first of all, we see between somewhere between 50 and 75 applications to the program per year. And those are often divided between projects that they're often evenly divided between projects that occur in the US and outside of the US. So we definitely are not necessarily funding more projects that take place in the United States. It depends entirely on the application, and we certainly historically have funded a lot of field work outside of the United States. I don't know the exact percentage, um, but we welcome applications for field work outside of the US. And I see the question from, we're a research lab at the American University at Beirut whose work is focused on Beirut, not an American city. Are we eligible to apply? I believe the answer is yes. I believe the American University of Beirut is an eligible institution. I would want to double check that, but I believe the case is yes.
Meredith, this is Jenny, and I see there's a question about institutional overhead that I'd be glad to answer. So it's, does the grant support institutional overhead? If so, does that come out of the award or is that granted in addition to the award? So the question here is about indirect costs, and yes, they are eligible. However, regrettably, that is all part of the $150,000 cap. So it would not be in addition to your direct costs. It would be part of the total award of $150,000. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And I see another question here about how do we do preliminary submissions? Will there be a specific button added to the website? So I assume that you mean the draft submissions. And in the case of draft submissions, so often what people are submitting is simply a draft of their narrative and a draft of the work plan, those two components of the application. And those can be simply emailed directly to our program um, email address that you see there on the slide. So there's not a different submission process. It's just you would email the components to our email address, and then typically we respond within 2 weeks. We'll see how many draft applications we get this year, though. And I'll just read one of the comments that Chris added to the chat here. Thank you, Chris. He noted that documenting projects such as oral history projects can be eligible, although they must be driven by clear research questions and data collection, and the data collection should have an ethnographic component. Thank you, Chris. That's super helpful. Chris, Amy, Jenny, do you see any questions that we missed? We did get one additional one here. Should applications coming from social scientists make more of an effort to clearly link the project to the humanities? Yes. In general, I would say the answer is yes to that. We really want to underscore that the research questions have humanities significant and relevance, that the overall project is related to the humanities. So if you're a sociologist, for example, who could be applying for a grant to do ethnographic fieldwork, you really want to think about how to structure your application so that the research questions, goals, the overall theoretical framework are really speaking to humanists as well. And we have an interesting question. What is the ratio of archaeology and ethnographic grants awarded? Is one more favored over the other, or are all weighed equally based on the pool of applications? So they're all weighed equally based on the pool of applications. However, historically, I think it's the case that we do tend to see more archaeological applications. And that's starting to change. And I think it's starting to change across the division of research in general. We're seeing people from different disciplinary backgrounds applying to do ethnographic work. So one is definitely not more favored over the other, but you want to make sure that you're thinking about the evaluation criteria when you're structuring and crafting your application.
This is Jenny. I wanted to add that there is a public-facing search tool on NEH's website where you can call up all of the awarded applications for all of NEH, but you can search for this competition and see a summary of the projects. And that will answer your questions about international versus domestic or ethnographic versus archaeology. You can see it live and in person there.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And Chris also posted the link to that in the chat. And I think the official title is the Funded Projects Query Forum, and that's a great resource. It also provides you with a brief project description of each of the projects, but these are all really good questions. Does this grant opportunity fund empirical field work on health research? It could. The questions would need to be humanities questions again. So we definitely see a lot of health humanities projects in the Division of Research more broadly, and we certainly see um, applications for ethnographic projects that deal with aspects where the questions deal with aspects of health and society and gender and sexuality, et cetera. So it certainly could. Um, it would also depend on the details of the project. And again, I think that would be a great, if you have those kinds of questions about whether or not your project is really suitable for this opportunity. Again, I think submitting something for the draft deadline or even just reaching out via email is probably the best way to go about answering really specific questions. And Chris also added that in applications that might deal with something like health, it's really important to emphasize that emphasize the scholarly research questions over more applied or public health type questions. And I think that that is a good um, piece of guidance for a few of the um, related to a few of the questions that we got. So we have an interesting question about budget and paying collaborators. What is the best way to think about how they are compensated in different countries? It can be a bit tricky. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Um, you would want to think about following any sort of disciplinary standards for that kind of compensation. Jenny might have some additional insight, but one of the things that we see is there is a budget justification document that is included along with budgets. And also in the narrative, people might include um, a couple notes, a few sentences regarding sort of best practices or standards related to compensating people in the country that they're working with, right? So just some sort of indication that you've thought through this. These are the best practices. This is typical sort of compensation for collaborators working in, X country. That's one of the ways that we've seen people handle that kind of question. And again, the way that that kind of um, issue is evaluated is it's really something that the peer reviewers are going to look at and sort of judge based on the standards of um, their fields and disciplines, as opposed to any hard and fast rule regarding that. Jenny, do you want to add anything related to that?
I think it's very important to make use of that justification that Meredith mentioned and to be very clear that you're talking about a local going rate.
But that's a great question because it will be the type of thing that peer reviewers might pick up on and might wonder. And so, another tip is to kind of think about the kinds of questions that your colleagues might be asking of your project design. Jenny, we have a question. Are there examples of budget justifications or budgets available?
At this time for this program, there is not. Some other NEH grant programs have sample budget justifications, but they would just give you a general idea of the kind of information we're looking for rather than anything maybe specific to this program.
Yes, thank you. These are great questions, and I'll sort of pause for another minute or so if anyone has additional questions. Amy and Jenny and Chris, let me know if we've missed anything that's come through the chat, and we can try to answer that right now.
I went back through. It looks like we've answered all the questions that have been posted.
Thank you so much. So I guess I'll just reiterate that please go ahead and send us an email if you have really specific questions to your project. I definitely would encourage people to submit drafts, even if they aren't, complete drafts, to that deadline, and then we can follow up and provide more feedback that's really specific to your project. We do have one final question. It seems like there's not much room for literature review. Should it all go into the intellectual significance part? Yeah, that's a good question. There is a bibliography document that is allowed, but you're exactly right. The two ways that people signal and gesture to the relevant humanities literature that they're in conversation with would be through the narrative itself, and then additionally in the bibliography. And so we do see people include references to important works right directly in the narrative, including in parentheses. That's acceptable. But you also want to sort of just, think about balance as a whole. You don't want it to be too marred down with citations to the larger literature that you're thinking about. But that's true. The bibliography document is not very long. And there's a final question here. Is preference given to applications with teams of collaborators rather than just one or two? No, there's not a preference given to teams versus individual scholars who, for example, might be conducting ethnographic work, right? Typically, we see several collaborators on archaeology projects, but a lot of the ethnographic projects that we see are being led and run by a single scholar. So that's perfectly acceptable. There's no preference. And the peer reviewers that are evaluating the projects are very much, sort of aware that, a good ethnographic project can take place with one individual as the lead. You would just want to, make it clear that, all of your planned activities are appropriate and one person is able to conduct them all. And then we have one more question here about how many projects do you expect to fund this year? That's a bit of a tricky question in the sense that we can just rely on sort of our historical data for that. And typically it's 6 projects per year. Our funding ratio for this program is about 11%. And I'll just note again that all NEH programs have a program webpage where they note how many awards were given out in the previous year and their funding ratios. So that's all available online. And for this program specifically, it's about 11%. Jenny, do you want to grab this question? Is there a yearly funding cap on the grant? That's a
I
good question.
believe that the NOFO, which I have pulled up, so of course the maximum allowed total is 150,000, and it seems to me that that is $75,000 each year. And I am looking because that's in the NOFO somewhere.
Yes, that's correct, and it is outlined in the notice of funding opportunity. Yeah.
Here it is on page 3. You may request up to $75,000 for a project with a period of performance between 4 and 12 months. You may request up to $75,000 per year for a project with a period of performance of 1 to 3 years, not to exceed $150,000.
These are great questions. So stay on for another minute. If there's any more questions, we can field those, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah, and the matching funds of $20,000 um, need to be requested regardless of the length of the grant. Yes, that's correct. If the project director is a tenured faculty member, that's correct. There is a match requirement. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. This was a great round of questions. We're always available via email. Myself and Amy answer those questions. And we also have Chris available to answer questions. And so we look forward to hearing from you. And I really encourage everyone to submit a draft at the upcoming deadline. Thank you so much and have a good afternoon.